to another episode of Accessibility. It's a show on YouTube where I talk about the video game industry, accessibility, and representation. Basically, how can we help more people to play games, and more people to see themselves in the games they play? On June 10th, 2021, a charming little indie game called Chicory was released. It's from the developers of a game called Wondersong, which is one of my favourite wonderful games about the beauty of music, and this game is that but for art. You play as a little anthropomorphic dog character who, after the world suddenly drains of colour mysteriously, finds a magic paintbrush and takes it upon themselves to take up the mantle of painting the world back to colourful life. The game is a very charming adventure that I had a delightful time playing through. It uses the mechanic of painting colour back into the world in both mechanically and narratively interesting ways, and it's just a really relaxing delight to play through, but on top of that, it's one of the best examples of accessibility in a game I've seen in a long time, and that deserves being checked out. So today, on Accessibility, we're going to talk about Chicory. We're going to talk about some of the design decisions made to make the game as playable as possible. We're going to talk about a bunch of the accessibility settings that can be found in-game, and we're going to talk about how Chicory handles content warnings for players who may require them. Let's start off today's episode of Accessibility by talking about one of Chicory's design choices that isn't strictly an accessibility setting. Players can play through Chicory from start to finish without hearing any audio, either due to being deaf or needing to play the game with sound turned off, and will not find any progression blocked by lack of audio. This sort of design thoughtfulness is becoming more common in games over time, making sure accessibility settings are not needed by designing your game intelligently upfront where possible. Next, onto the actual accessibility settings in-game. When first playing through Chicory, there was one accessibility setting in particular that stood out to me and prompting my wanting to make this video. A misophonia accessibility setting. Misophonia is a condition where a person has uncharacteristically strong negative emotional responses to certain types of noise. The noises that trigger responses in those with misophonia can differ from person to person, but one category of sound that is a common trigger is wet sounds, such as slurping or splodging. As Chicory is a game about painting, there are in-game sound effects that fall into this category involved in painting in the game. Chicory has a toggle in its settings menu to turn off all wet sounds, something I have never seen a game do before, and which will undoubtedly be a positive to see in other titles. This is a feature I would love to see become more common. Getting into the rest of the settings menu, Chicory has options for an in-game eye strain filter, which can be placed over the default stark white background, adding a subtle or strong orange wash to make looking at the screen for long periods of time more comfortable. Players can turn off flashing effects, screen shake, and text moving effects, which can make the game more playable for photosensitive, motion sick, and dyslexic players respectively. While Chicory's default in-game font is cute and fits the theming of the game's world, players can also switch text to a more legible alternative font. Button holds in Chicory can all be turned into toggles, and painting, on consoles, can be done using the right stick if you have difficulty using the PS4 or PS5's touchpad controls. Chicory also supports full controller remapping, with presets available to support players' dominant hand, level of comfort with adaptive trigger effects, and which stick is used for which in-game functions. Player health can be altered in the settings menu if you want to be a bit more resilient, and you can change the game speed in Chicory in increments of 25% to make navigating more manageable, very reminiscent of games like Celeste. Chicory does contain occasional boss fights punctuating its otherwise peaceful gameplay loop, but these can all be skipped by the player if they're proving to be a barrier to progression. For any players lost and unsure where to go, Chicory has a really nicely designed hint system for players. By stopping at a phone booth, players can chat with their character's mum, who will offer them gentle hints on how to progress. If the character is still stuck, they can ask for the phone to be handed over to Dad, who will be much more direct about how to progress, with detailed steps on where to go and what to do. There's never any penalty for accepting hints, and they're woven really nicely into the world of the game. Lastly, let's talk about content warnings. Without going too deep into spoilers, Chicory is a game that tackles themes of living with depression, and in places it can get a little emotionally heavy. However, the game contains a content warning system I would most closely compare to last year's release of Ikenfell. Players can opt in to be warned before emotionally difficult scenes start, with the option to either skip those scenes entirely or mentally prepare themselves before starting the given scene. Chicory's overall level of accessibility support is really robust and something that should be celebrated. It stands toe-to-toe with projects with much bigger budgets in terms of how it handles accessibility, but I want to take a minute to just really take in how nice it is when we see a game like Chicory move accessibility forward in some interesting way. In this case, it is the misophonia settings. It is looking at a group of disabled players who are very rarely thought about in terms of accessibility and adding something new. Chicory hasn't just looked at best practices of what other games are already doing to be accessible, but has thought carefully about what their game uniquely might cause problems for people, what solutions don't yet exist but could be helpful, and implemented those. It's always a delight on this show when I get to talk about a game that pushes accessibility forwards in some regard, and I really hope that Chicory's existence encourages other developers to consider, are players with misophonia a group that might be impacted by our game that we could help? This feels like a really positive thing to see. Chicory is a really beautiful, wonderful, touching indie game that I can't recommend highly enough outside of its accessibility settings, but those accessibility settings just push it over the edge. They make a game that I was already very eager to recommend to people something that I can do so without reservation. It's always wonderful when an indie developer really pushes the envelope forward on something, and I can't wait to see which indie developer next pushes forward on accessibility in a way that hopefully years from now will be a standard in our industry.